What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at the Week 13 main slate on DraftKings and FanDuel. Once again, we have a 10-game slate to walk through, and I'm going to give you some of the top plays, strategies, and lineup advice for attacking both low and high-risk contests this weekend in week number 13 in the NFL. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective on this week is kind of a free square week. Zach Moss, who's on the screen here, is the number one play on this slate. Not really a tremendous secret because we're projecting him for over 40% ownership on DraftKings, just under 40% ownership on FanDuel. Jonathan Taylor, unfortunately, going to miss a couple of weeks with a jammed thumb for the Colts. That news came out after salaries dropped for this week's contest. So Zach Moss here is just $4,600 here on DraftKings. One of the lowest prices you will see really all season long for a bell cow running back. Moss is $5,600 over on FanDuel, so same situation. Zach Moss played pretty heavily in place of Jonathan Taylor earlier in the season when he was out for 3 weeks. I believe it was weeks 2 through 4 that Moss carried the load for the Colts, and then in week 5, even though Taylor returned, Moss still played the majority of the snaps, had the majority of the opportunities in the offense. Looking at that 4-week sample, week 2 to week 5, Zach Moss had 72% of team carries for the Colts, was dealing with the Anthony Richardson rushing attempts as well, and still achieved that number, so it's pretty impressive. And he had 8% of team targets, so don't really need to justify Zach Moss much more beyond that. However, it is a little bit of a difficult matchup against the Tennessee Titans rush defense, which is above average this season. But at this cost, $4,600 here on DraftKings, $5,600 over on FanDuel, Moss is going to be the skeleton key that unlocks the slate here, guys, and allows us to fit whatever we want. So you definitely want to get him in the vast majority, if not all, of your lineups this week. Definitely in your low-risk lineups. Now, normal agenda of the show, I do like to go through the other running backs that are on the table based off of the biggest favorites on the board, because that tells us which running backs are most likely going to be in positive game script environments on this slate. There are 3 decent favorites on this slate. We have the Miami Dolphins favored by 8.5 points in their matchup against the Commanders. The Steelers are favored by 6.5 points this week in their matchup with the Arizona Cardinals. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are favored by 5.5 points in their matchup with the Carolina Panthers. Going back to the Miami Dolphins here for a minute, I would say this is an interesting week to consider Raheem Mostert at super low ownership. We're projecting Mostert here for just 2% ownership on DraftKings, 1% ownership on FanDuel. However, Devon Achane is going to return for Miami here in Week 13, according to Coach Mike McDaniel. So that is something we have to reckon with if we're considering playing a low-owned Miami running back here. The game script dictates that this is going to be an interesting spot for the Dolphins. So we definitely want to consider them in high-risk tournaments, but I don't think either of these running backs is low-risk viable. There's another way that we're going to get exposure to Miami in low-risk this week, and it's the same way we usually do. It's going to be through Tyreek Hill himself at wide receiver. So the Dolphins in a positive game script. Pittsburgh Steelers in their matchup with the Arizona Cardinals. We saw Kyren Williams take advantage of this really, really poor Arizona Cardinals rush defense last week. It's now going to be Jaylen Warren's turn primarily. Did see Warren get more opportunities, more playing time last week, and in a curious twist of fate, Najee Harris ended up being more efficient on the ground. Actually did end up with a couple of more carries, no involvement in the passing game. But once again, the two-headed monster here of Warren and Harris is going to be on the table. We do prefer Jaylen Warren because I do think this is the running back that they will lean on more. But honestly, the field is not really playing either of these guys super heavily. So I would say both Warren and Harris at fairly attractive prices in a good matchup, to be honest with you, are just high risk only on this slate because it's not likely either is going to see much more than 15 opportunities here in week number 13. Rashad White. Every week we talk about Rashad White from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He is going to be facing the worst rush defense in the NFL. He's going to be facing a below average defense defending running backs in the passing game, and his price is stuck on this $6,000 range on DraftKings once again here in week 13. Positive game script expected. Good matchup for Rashad White. Really doesn't have to be much more complex than that. Rashad White's going to be one of our favorite low-risk running backs this week because of the consensus of factors, playing at home against a pretty poor defense this week and a reasonable salary over on FanDuel as well of $7,500. So those are the three biggest favorites on this slate in week number 13. Talked about Zach Moss as the free square. The other running back that we have to work with this week, the best one in the league, Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. CMC's workload is absolutely outrageous. And it has been for a long time, right? But just to put some math behind it once again for you, seeing over 60% of team carries in this 49ers offense, which is impressive when you consider that they still work in Elijah Mitchell. Deebo Samuel gets his gadget play touches in the backfield. McCaffrey also with a 25% target share over the last 3 weeks for the 49ers. You see 5+ targets in each of the last 4 games. 16+ carries in each of the last 3 games. Now has a really, really big game against the Philadelphia Eagles on deck. This could be, it's a rematch of last year's NFC Championship with the 49ers having a real quarterback for it, so that's big for them. But this is also potentially a preview of what's to come in January in the NFC, and you can expect them to lean on McCaffrey heavily to make sure they get the result they want in this contest. McCaffrey's matchup is difficult, but he is an above-average player. I feel like I say that week in and week out about these high-end running backs. The Eagles are the number 2 defense in the league defending running backs through the air and inside the top 5 defending running backs on the ground. But we're not going to worry about that with Christian McCaffrey. We're going to focus more on the touches, which are 25 plus when you combine his targets and rush opportunities. And with the existence of Zach Moss on this slate, with another value at tight end, with some cheap defenses that we're considering, I do think we can get McCaffrey into our low-risk lineups this week. So I do like him as part of our top 3 at the running back position alongside the free square in Zach Moss and the heavily favored Tampa Bay Buccaneers running back Rashad White at home against the Carolina Panthers. So where else is the field going to be in low-risk contests? Tyreek Hill, Miami Dolphins, most expensive wide receiver on the slate, most expensive player on the slate, is going to be worth the price of admission. 10+ targets in every single game since week number 6. Seems to always score a touchdown, seems to almost always go over 100 yards. Really not worth debating or overthinking this spot too much, especially with value on the board. We have Miami with the highest applied team total on this slate with 29.25 points projected in this spot. We have the Commanders coming into this game with one of the worst pass defenses in the league, and the Dolphins coming into this game with one of the best pass blocking units in the league. Good matchup for Tyreek Hill out in the secondary as well. Commanders are the worst defense defending wide receiver ones in the league, so Tyreek Hill is going to be the number 1 play at wide receiver in low and probably high-risk contests as well here in week number 13. There's a pair of, if you can believe it, Cleveland Browns that are going to be popular values in low-risk contests this week. Joe Flacco is going to be making his debut for the Cleveland Browns as starting quarterback here in week number 13. Mari Cooper got pretty banged up last week. Sounds like he's going to be available to play in this game in week 13. But Elijah Moore, operating largely out of the slot for the Cleveland Browns this season, is going to have a strong opportunity with Joe Flacco under center. He has always loved his slot wide receiver. Moore with about 40% of his routes from the slot last week, so he will kick outside every once in a while. But finally starting to see the opportunities move up for Elijah Moore in general in this Browns offense. 7+ targets over the last 3 weeks. And at his price tag, especially here on DraftKings, he's going to be a value play people are going to get into their lineups. At the tight end position, David Njoku has been leading this team in targets for weeks now. See 9+ over the last 3 weeks. The yardage hasn't necessarily matched that opportunity. The touchdowns definitely have not. He's not on our list here, but you could definitely argue based off of the raw opportunity for the Chief here that he has somewhat underperformed his opportunities, has just under a 30% target share for the Browns over the last 3 weeks of play. New quarterback here with Joe Flacco in week number 13, so we'll see what is to come. However, Njoku probably closer to one of the more healthy high-end options for the Browns. Just $4,100 here as a tight end. He is going to be extremely, extremely popular in low-risk contests and is probably the low-risk tight end you should play. There is another tight end I am interested in. It is definitely far more high risk, but we did learn on Friday that Dalton Schultz is going to be out this week, and that is going to take Brevin Jordan and thrust him into the starting tight end role for CJ Stroud's Houston Texans at the minimum price here on DraftKings, just $4,300 over on FanDuel. I think playing Jordan does get you a little bit more salary flexibility on this slate, and so that's a big reason why I am actually interested in it myself here. 48.33 per player remaining for a quarterback, our final wide receiver, and a defense. This week on defense, everyone in low-risk contests especially is going to be playing the Atlanta Falcons against Tim Boyle's New York Jets at just $3,400. We have this defense projected at over 20% ownership on this slate. So as far as low risk is concerned, I think you just match the field here with the Atlanta Falcons. We have 55.50 per player remaining. At the quarterback position, I can tell you that it once again is going to be a week where the field is looking to treat this as more of like a last man in spot and jam some of these skill players. I do think in low risk especially, we want to make sure we get Tyreek and McCaffrey into our lineup. So I do think this is the preferred bill, at least on DraftKings. So that means in low risk, the field is going to be looking at quarterbacks in this low $6,000 to high $5,000 salary range. And the two popular ones that the field will play, I believe it'll be Russell Wilson on the road against the Houston Texans, the cheaper option that I think is safer to deploy here. But then we also have Brock Purdy from the San Francisco 49ers, and they are the favorite side of this game against the Philadelphia Eagles for just a few $100s more. I think that's probably going to be where the field goes, either Purdy or Russell Wilson. I don't have a problem with either. I think slight edge in my book to Purdy from a projection standpoint, but the $400 in savings for Russell Wilson plus a little bit of mobility and rushing upside with Russell Wilson is worth playing him at $5,700 here against the Houston Texans. So $5,400 for the final wide receiver spot if you're going with the Brevin Jordan punt for a low-risk lineup. And now I think you're in a really good spot to build a low-risk lineup on this slate. Also think you're in a pretty good spot to build a high-risk lineup, frankly, because one of our favorite ways to stack this slate is with one of the highest total games on the board at 48 points this weekend. So Denver and Houston is going to be a top game stack environment for us this week. It's not the top environment for us this week. Number one stack for me is going to be the Miami Dolphins. Focus on the points there, right? Tua, Tyreek, Waddle. We do have on the Washington side an underperforming wide receiver in Terry McLaurin. McLaurin has had 26 targets over the last 3 weeks. He's got over a 37% share of team air yards, over 20% of the targets at that number, and no touchdowns. So Terry McLaurin is an underperforming wide receiver, an interesting bringback in this matchup against the Miami Dolphins. Let you build a nice 3-1 here, I think. Another option that's really affordable and this player has seen a ton of targets in this offense, Logan Thomas at tight end as well would let you do this. We know if we go with the Youper in Terry McLaurin, especially after DK's explosion on Thursday night. I know you're all interested in the underperforming wide receivers. We know we have this core of a cheap play in Zach Moss, and let's go with the tight end punt in Brevin Jordan. And that's pretty much how we're going to get the salary to work with any game stack that we want this week. $44.50 per player remaining for these final two spots. This might be another spot on this high, expensive stack here, where you could go with the double tight end lineup and like Rashad White at running back or Javonte Williams with the Broncos is going to be pretty popular. Play a cheaper wide receiver instead of playing Jaylen Waddle and have a 2-1 stack with the Dolphins, and that's how you make that work. The 49ers and the Eagles, the other game on this slate that I think is really, really worth stacking in high-risk contest, one of the late-game hammers on this slate. I do prefer the Philadelphia side. Jalen Hurts, we always see what he can do, last week especially, on the ground, with the tush-push. That definitely raises his floor every single week. Very expensive this week, obviously. We have A.J. Brown is still my favorite Eagle wide receiver at the amount of work that he's been seeing, and definitely trending towards being on the underperforming wide receiver list, although with the recent touchdowns, not so much. And then obviously Devontae Smith, who has seen his work go up significantly in the absence of Dallas Goedert, would be an option as well. On the San Francisco side, McCaffrey is my favorite run back on this offense. Salary definitely tight here, but we know we have Brown's value in Elijah Moore, and now we have $5,000 per player remaining to fill out this lineup. Definitely doable, even using the very popular Rashad White in the flex. There are wide receivers in this price range that help us get where we want to go in high-risk contests. Flip this around a little bit. You can come off Hurts. You can play the significantly cheaper, relative to Hurts anyway, Brock Purdy, who's going to be a popular play. 58 per player remaining, and we can probably fiddle with the salary here a little bit to get another 49er in here if we wanted to. But even if we went with just the non-traditional quarterback running back stack of Purdy and McCaffrey, I do think that's a really interesting way to consider stacking this game. And there are plenty of wide receivers around this $5,800 range that are in play here. Going over to FanDuel, before I let you all go and get ready for the slate here, I do think the salary is a little tighter, and so it's a little harder to get both Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey in your low-risk lineups. So this is a little bit closer to what I think will be the FanDuel build, going with Javonte Williams instead of Christian McCaffrey, $7,000 remaining for a final wide receiver spot. And this does pretty much jive with what we have in projected ownership on FanDuel. You see the big four on this slate. 4 running backs I've pretty much talked about the entire time: Zach Moss, Rashad White, Christian McCaffrey, and Javonte Williams at $9,800 on FanDuel. Even though you get that extra $10,000 in the FanDuel budget, just the way they price players across the board, it does make it a little harder to get both Tyreek and McCaffrey in here. So I will lean towards the biggest favorite status and the implied points on the board for the Dolphins and go with Tyreek Hill as the better of the 2 expensive plays in low risk on FanDuel. Wide receivers that are underperforming their recent opportunities. Mentioned Terry McLaurin as an option in the Miami and Washington game stack. Number 1 underperforming wide receiver in our model this week, we've got Pittsburgh's Deontay Johnson, Arizona's Marquise Brown, Houston's Tank Dell, Tennessee's DeAndre Hopkins, Cleveland's Amari Cooper and Elijah Moore, and Pittsburgh's George Pickens. A pair of Steelers, a pair of Browns, a run back in the Dolphins game. A lot of great options here that are underperforming their recent opportunity. And once again, we saw what can happen with these wide receivers on Thursday night with DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks with his big 3-touchdown game. If someone else is going to have a game like that this weekend, we like one of these guys to experience that kind of regression that we can benefit from in fantasy football. A couple of them appearing in the potential low-risk lineup in Elijah Moore, and even Terry McLaurin himself might be a little popular this week. That's it for me here as far as going over the top plays for you in week number 13 in the NFL. Do you have any questions about this slate? Please leave a comment in the comment sections below. I'll be monitoring that throughout the weekend, and I'll do my best to get back to you. We'd really appreciate it if you could give us a thumbs up on this video, and please make sure you are subscribed to the channel. That's the best way for you to get notified as we go into the final home stretch here of the regular season and postseason in the NFL of all the content that we have coming out for you. We've got NBA videos happening every single day on this channel. If you're interested in the content we're putting out, the best way for you to know when it is primed and ready to go for you is that subscribe button with the notifications turned on. As always, folks, good luck in week number 13, and I will be back next week to talk to you about week 14 in the NFL.